So welcome. We are so glad you're here. I'm Sara Brumfield with FromThePage, and I'm here today with Ben, my partner, and we wanted to tell you about what we've learned from over a decade of running crowdsourcing projects. Next slide. Manning the waiting room.
People are still joining, yes.
So we'll send out a resource list with links to a lot of the things we mentioned in today's webinar, but here's our basic plan is we're going to talk about FromThePage, which is our crowdsourcing platform. But we're going to talk more generally about what effective crowdsourcing is, thinking about volunteers, selecting your material, developing your transcription instructions, kicking off your project, and then keeping your volunteers engaged. We'll have time, that probably lasts about half an hour or so, and then we'll have time for discussion, and then we'll kind of do a demo from the page for anyone who'd like to stick around for that.
Okay. So as Sara mentioned, we run a platform for crowdsourced manuscript transcription, OCR correction, and metadata enhancement called FromThePage. So there are a number of different kinds of crowdsourcing tasks. We tend to focus on crowdsourcing around archival material, letters, diaries, papers. We do think that a lot of the lessons that we've learned over the years can be applied to other kinds of tasks as well. So we want this to be as generally useful as possible. In brief, our platform lets people see the image of a page and transcribe the text from the image. We try to keep the technology as simple as possible because, frankly, transcribing handwritten text is hard enough. And we've seen a lot of successful projects over the years. This is just a handful of the institutions that we've partnered with on FromThePage. So let's talk about effective crowdsourcing. So effective crowdsourcing, in our opinion, is a collaboration between an institution, a memory institution, and the public, right? So it's a two-way collaboration. The goal, one of the big goals, is deep public engagement with special collections and archives.
Kind of figure the transcription is a byproduct of that engagement. If you do it right, you get both.
So when I say deep engagement, I want to clarify that. So a lot of organizations have social media presences, Instagram accounts, things like that, ways of sharing their material more broadly with the public. And that's really, really great for engagement. But one of the challenges is that oftentimes the only way that members of the public can interact with that material is through clicking a like button. So it's a very shallow kind of engagement, right? It doesn't let people contribute their passion and their knowledge back to the institution. It doesn't build community around the collections. And it's not really very immersive, right? You see a picture. It's kind of an awesome picture, but, I don't have an opportunity to discuss with other people, why she's wearing this particular kind of tie. So in addition to being about public engagement, crowdsourcing and cultural heritage is also about improving metadata for digitized collections in ways that require massive human interpretation. Now, that doesn't mean massive numbers of items. It doesn't mean massive numbers of humans, but it's the kind of thing, like it could just be, in this case, one document that has been transcribed by one volunteer, but that's the kind of thing that institutions don't have the budgets or the priorities to commit their resources to doing when oftentimes they're facing, piles and piles of unprocessed boxes and donations.
And they may not have the skills. This example here is very specialized. It's in German. It's about orchids. It has a bunch of scientific names in Latin. So that's a lot of knowledge that, a very particular volunteer was great at, but maybe a staff member or a member of the general public might not be the right person to work on this.
So speaking of of archival staff, effective crowdsourcing is really only possible with the guidance and engagement of librarians and archivists. You can't replace staff members and information professionals with the crowd. It just doesn't work.
So we have a cute picture of a puppy here because our standing joke is that crowdsourcing is not free as in speech or free as in beer, but it's free as in puppy. The puppy's free, but then you have to take care of it. You have a lot of work to do. Volunteers who are participating in these projects don't like to be ignored. They don't like having their work lost or unused. They're doing something that they feel is meaningful and they're engaging with you. Therefore, you need to make sure their work is meaningful and engage with them.
Yeah, we have a friend who says, people think that they're going to have volunteers come in and do their homework for them, when actually what they've got is a whole new set of homework assignments. They do these projects.
So let's talk about the work that goes into successful crowdsourcing projects. Let's start with volunteers, because if you don't have volunteers, you aren't going to have a successful crowdsourcing project, right? So I used to have just one slide on this, but now I have like 4 because volunteers are so important to crowdsourcing projects. So this is actually a snapshot of a week on FromThePage. It was right after we'd hit our 2 millionth page transcribed. And over that week, we had about 450 volunteers working on our platform. And when we look across a year, we have about 5,000 volunteers. So that's kind of exciting, just how many people are working hard, diligently on different institutions' collections. We want that magic to happen for every project on FromThePage, for you to post your material and for one of these volunteers to find it and start working on it. And we're working hard right now to come up with better and better and better ways for that to happen. Ways for volunteers to find interesting, active, well-managed projects. It's not always easy. So one of the things we do is we send out a monthly newsletter that features new projects, but we have a whole bunch of stuff in the pipeline that we're hoping will improve this process as well. Because of that, we also suggest that you work to recruit volunteers locally in a couple of different axes, because your most dedicated volunteers are often the ones with ties to your location or ties to your material. There's lots of different ways to find volunteers. So let's kind of talk about it. So this picture is from a Library of Virginia's volunteers, and they actually have this very, very robust crowdsourcing program. And this is their annual transcribiversary. They actually invite people in to see some of the material, like physically, to be able to look at the material they've been working on. They give them t-shirts, they feed them cake. And what I love is how diverse this group is. We know that a lot of our volunteers tend to skew older. Retirees love these projects, but LVA has a lot of students who do work with them as well. So I would encourage you to start by thinking, where can we find volunteers? Who will they be? Do you already have volunteers that work with your institutions? Do you have people who are local who are interested? Maybe you have material that your local historical societies would be super excited to work on, or your local genealogists would be excited to work on. Maybe you're deep in a particular subject matter and you can reach out to communities around that subject matter. So for instance, we did an early project with the Yaquina Head lighthouses. They had lighthouse keepers logs for decades, and they were able to engage with the lighthouse fans. It turns out there's a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about lighthouses. You can see here on the left, that's the Reddit group for lighthouses, and they have, I thought I had a screenshot, yeah, 2.7 thousand members. So that's a lot of people, and you do not need anywhere near 2,700 people to work on your project. You would actually be thrilled if you had 5 active volunteers, because what we find is people are so passionate, they put a lot of time in, and you don't need large numbers of volunteers. You just need really dedicated, passionate volunteers. And so a lot of our advice is kind of, how do you keep building that dedication and building those relationships and that passion? Next slide. So when you think about volunteers, you can also think about what material has been most popular with your patrons and why it's popular. This image is a volunteer with the Missouri State Archives. She's holding her grandfather's birth certificate. Genealogists love projects with lots of names and vital information, even though that material is not as engaging as a diary or a letter. So we've seen some very successful projects with genealogists or with heritage organizations. The DAR is an amazing group of volunteers to work on projects like this, if you have a relationship with them, or if you can build a relationship with your local DAR chapter. You should also realize that crowdsourcing may not be something you're familiar with, but it's also something your volunteers may not be familiar with. It's a bit intimidating, right? So if you think through how to make it easier for them, that puts you in a really good mindset for working with your volunteers. This is kind of new to a lot of people. What we see is that volunteers and transcribers get really into this type of work. It's fun, it's engaging. So this Venn diagram represents the most active transcribers on 3 different projects. There were World War I projects, so they had topical overlap. And their projects from the Indiana Archives, the Library of Virginia, and the California State Library. What you see is that while the bulk of their active transcribers, these are people who did at least 10 pages of work, were independent, there were overlaps. So there were some volunteers who went from project to project. We actually have one volunteer who once a month will scroll through our list of projects looking for something she hasn't worked on and then hop in and try something new. It's kind of fascinating because if she finds something she's really interested in, she goes deep and puts a lot of time in. And sometimes she does a page or 2 and then she moves on. So, and we're seeing more and more of those really dedicated volunteers who just love the act of working on this material and are looking for work to do.
So let's talk about selecting material. How do you find material that is appropriate for a crowdsourcing project? So volunteers are motivated by a number of things. Not every volunteer is motivated by the same thing. So one thing to look for is material that can tell good stories. So if you get started reading a diary, you want to turn the page, you want to find out what happens next. So letters and diaries provide intrinsic motivation through the narrative. Volunteers build a connection with the people in the story. As in this example, what you see on the top is an email that I received on a project that I ran. And you see down at the bottom a passage selected that is roughly the location that this volunteer was working on when she sent me this email. And you can see, like, she's really concerned. What is going to happen with this member of this family? Right? What's wrong with Josie? Right? And that's
She has
cancer. She has stomach cancer and she will die in 3 months is the answer, unfortunately. But but this kind of connection is really, really powerful, right? It is transcribing is deep reading. It is very immersive. Narratives aren't the only things, though, that can be immersive. Non-narrative material can also work the same way. When the Alabama State Archives indexed their World War I service card collection, those cards were organized by county. So as a result, volunteers who were working on one particular county would get a snapshot of a community in 1918 as they indexed each service member's name, how old they were, where they enlisted, what branch they were in. It was this really neat connection to their community then, because most of these volunteers were actually from the counties that they were transcribing. You can also be successful with material that has a lot of local history or genealogy. The Indianapolis Public Library ran a project transcribing records from Indianapolis public schools. In my opinion, these records are really dry, just lists of names of students, list of names of parents, but they are a genealogist's goldmine, and volunteers understand that. A lot of volunteers are genealogists themselves, they are history buffs, and they have benefited from these kinds of records being put online, made accessible, and made findable. And so they want to contribute back.
So we find that if you can give your volunteers a sense of accomplishment, that's very motivating. Like, I think many of us are motivated by checking things off the list. So that's part of why the World War I service card project was so successful. It was only a single card. They only collected about 5 fields from each card. So each transcriber could get a lot done. We all like to get things done, and that feeling of accomplishment kept them coming back. That particular project, the Alabama Department of Archives and History's project, had 111,000 World War I service cards. They transcribed them all in 2.5 months. Because their material hit so many of these points. They had great relationships with their local genealogy and history organizations. It was immersive. People felt like they got things done. It's a model project. It was so successful.
So after you've selected material, the next thing to do is to work on instructions, defining the tasks. So for transcription projects, that means giving people instructions on how to transcribe. And the reason you do this is because the minute anyone encounters a word that's unclear to read, or they hit an abbreviation or spelling that's non-standard, they're going to have questions. So we encourage projects to develop transcription conventions that give instructions to volunteers about what to do when they hit these things. We actually show this on the transcription screen itself, so it's right underneath the field volunteers are typing into. They can see it if they run into problems. And here's an example that conventions are project specific, right? They're project by project. Each project may have different needs. This example is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they do a great job kind of explaining what to do, tips and tricks, things like that.
The cool thing about From the Page is because, you as institutions are happy to collaborate, and almost all, 2/3 of our projects are public projects. You can go look at what other people do, and we give you examples in the documentation, and you can kind of pick and choose what you need to get your project started.
Most of us don't have a background in scholarly editing, and so coming up with transcription conventions is new to us. As you're developing instructions, one thing that we recommend is that you transcribe a few example pages yourself, for two reasons. One is that you can upload those as a separate section and link to them so that people can go look at your examples. The other reason is because the act of doing the work exposes you to the kinds of challenges people will run into with the material you're working on itself. Right? It is a way of you coming up with the proper instructions. And if you can go grab people, get a handful of staff members, somebody who isn't familiar with this, they could be from a totally different part of your organization, and ask them to transcribe a page or two. Listen to the questions that they ask you, listen to the frustrations they have, and record all that in your instructions. It is a great way to get the perspective of someone who's doing this task for the first time. So that's an important part of kicking off a project, developing these transcriptions, but it's also a way to launch projects, right? It's not just setting up, it's also getting things going. We mentioned bringing people together, having kind of a mini transcribe-a-thon. The Library of Virginia does a transcribe-a-thon every month, but you don't have to do that. You can do one at the very beginning of a project, bring in people who may be leaders in their field or in their communities. So you bring in the people who are active in genealogy organizations, local history organizations, naturalist organizations to do an in-person transcribe-a-thon, and getting everyone in the same room is really nice because it gets people over the hump, the discomfort of what am I doing here? Is my work good enough, right? And then they're able to take the expertise they get, the enthusiasm and the confidence back to their communities and enlist other people and encourage them to join in.
The picture is actually from a University of Virginia transcribe-a-thon on the Julian Bond papers. Yeah, just in case you're wondering.
Transcribe-a-thons are often an event that local media like to highlight. They're a great way to kind of get the word out. The New Orleans Jazz Museum did a transcribe-a-thon working with French language documents from colonial New Orleans. And you can see on the left a Facebook post encouraging people to participate. The interesting thing about this is that the post isn't by the Jazz Museum. The post is by the French department at Tulane saying, if you're interested in colonial French, maybe you want to go do this thing because it's pretty cool. You can immerse yourself in that. On the right-hand side, you've got an example of someone who's posting from a transcribe-a-thon as it happens, saying, check it out, I'm learning how to read, Old English paleography. So they are a really nice way to kind of get the word out.
Even if you choose not to do a transcribe-a-thon, and you do not have to do one, you should definitely do some outreach and some marketing. If you have existing outreach venues, if you have mailing lists, social media accounts, you should definitely use those and mention and kind of push your project. If you have a physical location, you can do handouts that people can grab as they're walking in or out the door or at the checkout desk. But you can also look for subject matter enthusiast communities, people who would be interested in the material and might not be local. On Facebook, you can often find groups. On Twitter, sometimes you can find people, groups of people or accounts that are doing that. There may even be like magazines, like the Lighthouses is a pretty broad interest topic, but there are magazines that are dedicated to lighthouses. We have a whole post on our blog about how to find organizations who might be interested in a particular subject matter. Next slide. So we've also seen local news channels, both print and television, pick up these projects because they're interesting, they're visual, you have cool looking old documents, you've got people that can come in and take pictures of, and they're feel-good stories. They're ways for the local community to contribute to your mission of preserving memory. So this is coverage by a local TV station of a project from the Seattle Municipal Archives. This is the archivist there, Jeannie Fisher, and I I just love this screenshot because you can just really feel the history around her. She's got the documents in front of her and all the ledgers and books behind her. And so this was a really neat way to promote her project and to get local volunteers to be interested in it and come work on it. We also see news coverage in print. So when the North Carolina State Archives launched their Colonial Court Records project, they had coverage in 2 large newspapers. So it happened to be around the holidays, slow news days, and it brought in a lot of interested volunteers. These were actually the highest number of visits to From the Page's website that whole year, was when these 2 news articles were published. So again, I think you can reach out and you can get a lot of interest in these projects by your local news. Once you kick off a project, you're starting to get volunteers working on it, you should think about how to keep them engaged. It's not unusual for volunteers to drop by, to transcribe a page, and you may never see them again. So we have a couple of suggestions for keeping those volunteers engaged, because the more you can keep them engaged, the more you'll accomplish. But I think it helps to have this mindset that it's not about getting someone to do work for you. It's about offering your users the opportunity to participate in public memory. And that kind of gives you a good framework. That's a great quote by Trevor Owens, who's a deep thinker in the digital humanities. So the first thing is to welcome new users. So we, From the Page, sends out a note every night to every project owner telling them what's gone on in their collections the previous day. You'll get something like the screenshot at the bottom where it shows you the name of someone who joined your project, what's kind of going on in it. You can also go in your collaborator tab and see people who join, and you can grab their email addresses and you can send them an email. This is if they've opted in. And it can be a stock email, but if you can tell them what the project is, the purpose of it. Volunteers really like purpose and what the transcribed material is going to be used for. If you happen to have any training materials, you can link to that. Show them your transcription conventions, but include how to contact you. You want them to be able to ask you questions or share something they've found, really cool stories in the material that you might have missed, or see if they can bring in a group of 20 other people to help you transcribe. All of those things you want them to be able to find you. So make it easy. So in addition to welcoming new users, you should respond to questions and comments. So that nightly email will also include comments and questions from your collaborators from the volunteers who are transcribing from you.
So volunteers can ask questions as they work. And on our platform, at least, the answers by staff or other volunteers all appear on the pages where people are transcribing the material. So there's an interesting example over here on the left-hand side. This is from one of the Yaquina Head lighthouses. And you've got a volunteer, Olivia, who posts saying, there's a lot of activity around a hack. On the 12th, they clean it, they paint it. On the next few days, they varnish it. What is a hack, right? And we've looked at this ourselves, and we see that originally she's not sure she was reading the word correctly, but eventually she decides, no, it is the word hack, but what does that mean? So when she left that note on that page, and the next morning, the people who were running the projects, the Friends of the Lighthouses, got her note in their nightly activity email, and they did something that we think is absolutely wonderful. They responded immediately saying, we don't know. But the important thing about that is that, when they responded, she got an email, and so she knows that she's not just asking questions into the void. Someone is paying attention, and lo and behold, a day or two later, they responded, they discussed it, somebody looked up hack boat in a dictionary and discovered that it's a general purpose boat, something that's totally reasonable. On the right-hand side, you'll see an example of this nightly activity email. And that's an example of some of the comments that sometimes you see. They're not all questions. They could be people elaborating on an unfamiliar term. They could be, almost biographical entries saying, oh, hey, here's who this person is, or this thing that was mentioned here. I looked this up and learned this thing about it.
So the other thing that we recommend is that you include your contact information. We have a footer that you can configure that shows up on every page of your project. This one's from the LA County Library. They link to their Facebook. their Twitter, their Instagram, and that questions contact us link is actually a mail to form where you can email them if you have questions. This is a great example. They kind of did a lot of HTML to configure it, but we have examples of how to do it their way, or just to put a simple one-liner that says questions, contact us, and your email address. All of those fair game, because a lot of people don't. Some people don't like asking questions in public. They don't like looking stupid in public. I think we all don't like looking stupid in public. So that's kind of gives them another way to find you. The other thing that we found is sometimes material will show up. So when Ben started running the farm diary project that we've kind of alluded to earlier, a diary showed up in the mail.
Yes, yes. And it's not the only time this has happened. There have been a handful of projects in which that we host where the project owner has not included a footer, and we suddenly get email from someone saying, hey, I have material that relates to your collection. How do I bring it into your archives? And that's pretty cool, but we prefer them to actually
contact you instead of us. Yes. So our next one is to send a newsletter. This is kind of our last recommendation. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be big. Doing something just as often as you can, once a month, if you really are pushing hard and trying to get a project done, is great. If you can only get it out once a quarter, lost my slide there, that's okay too. You can pull in a list of your collaborators from the project owner view, and you can just paste them into your email client, BCC, or you can use them in something like MailChimp or Constant Contact or another newsletter tool. And we have a blog post on our blog that has lots of different examples of what people will do for crowdsourcing project newsletters. So, I wanted to kind of close with thinking about the bigger purpose of crowdsourcing. We all kind of individually benefit from the work done by our volunteers, but the entire historical community benefits from increased public awareness of appreciation for what we do. Crowdsourcing invites citizens to join in that work, giving them a sense of responsibility for the past that we all share, and a direct personal connection to the people who made it, and a desire to support and protect the institutions that preserve it. So that's kind of our formal presentation today. But if you're the littlest bit inspired, I'd encourage you to kind of push on that and act on that. We're trying something new this month, and we're offering these quick start calls. If you bring 200 pages, a PDF zip file of images, we will work together with you to get your project configured and launched. We'll work on those transcription conventions. You're, writing your description so it includes a sense of purpose, all of the things that we talked about today. And it's no strings attached. We really just want you to see the magic of crowdsourcing so you can start imagining how to make it part of your archives work. So the link for that, the recording for this presentation, plus the resources we mentioned, will be included in an email that we send out tomorrow or Monday.
Okay, so that's the end of our formal presentation. We are half an hour in, and so let's open. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to open the floor up for questions and comments. But there have been a couple of questions already in the chat. So let's start with addressing that first. So Montserrat says, do we have suggestions for platforms or apps that work for volunteer communication? That is a great question. 2 answers. Right. One answer is that we have seen people successfully use Facebook groups for general discussion. The other answer is that if you use FromThePage, we do everything we can to support volunteer communication in 3 different ways. One way is, as Sara demonstrated, you get to see the email addresses of everyone who's worked on your project if they've opted into sharing email. And that's in a format that can be used to add to MailChimp or other list software. But really just paste it into Outlook or
your email client if you need to send them an email. But more importantly, I think, is the communication around the transcription, right?
Right, around the task. Right. And what we want to avoid is a situation in which volunteers and staff members are asking questions and having arguments about material that's not the same material, right? We want people to be looking at the same pages and the same transcripts, the same images while they're discussing them. And that's one of the reasons why we support the on-page notes feature, because we really think the conversations about the task should happen in the context of the task itself.
And your collection landing page shows a list of all the recent notes, and you can actually open up and go back and see older ones. We also have a forums feature that will add a forum tab to a given project. And so some of the things that you might think about doing Facebook groups with, you could do there. It kind of depends on where you're used to interacting and monitoring and being with your people.
Right. I do think, to Natasha's suggestion, given the demographics of most of the really active volunteers we've seen, I think Facebook is a better option than Reddit. I think it's a lot easier to access. I think the interface is
it's not only that,
familiar.
People are already there. Many of our volunteers are retired or definitely older, and they're not demographically, they're not hanging out on Reddit.
This is direct.
So there was a direct question, but we're going to actually read it out loud. We won't necessarily say who it's from if you don't want to claim it. But we'd love to get more youth, like high school and older, involved in transcribing, and they can get volunteer hours for school. Actually, our middle schooler has started transcribing because she wants volunteer hours. The lack of cursive writing and reading seems to limit participation in a lot of original documents that are not typed. So how are people working around that? So this is, I think, really interesting, and it comes up a lot, and there's a number of different answers for it. So Baylor University did a project within a kind of freshman history class, and 18-year-olds today definitely fall in this demographic that you're talking about, where they haven't learned cursive, and they figured it out. So they kind of did a couple of things that worked really well. They put the professor and the archivist at the front of the room, and they were doing live transcription with everyone watching them, which shows that even people who know what they're doing make mistakes and have to puzzle it out and struggle through it, right? So having that humility in front of the people that you're trying to teach, I think, helps. The state archivist of Missouri will also do that, and
Yes.
he's terrible.
Yes, it's great. He gets up and he makes all these mistakes, and the volunteers call out, no, do it this way, or you typed the wrong thing. And it's fantastic because it builds confidence and it reinforces what the task is supposed to be about.
Right. The other thing that Baylor did is they paired students up. So it's very hard to do it by yourself, but if you're sitting next to someone and you're talking about it and working it out together and it's a puzzle, that works really well. It won't be for everyone, but don't underestimate people's ability to do this, right? And the other thing that we've seen that works really well is pairing someone who's older with someone who's younger. So you get someone who's older, understands handwriting, letter forms, not just letters, but like, dear so-and-so, sincerely so-and-so. Like, a lot of students don't get that these days either. Someone who understands that, and someone who's really facile on computers and knows, can type and can use a mouse really well and things like that. That kind of pairing works really well.
We have a question from Dale Kassler asking how columnar material gets set up. So from the page, and I can show you this in a minute, we have 3 different types of configurations for projects. One of them is the kind of plain text, where you're working with letters and diaries. Another one is field-based, and the third one is basically columnar or spreadsheet style. So for that, you basically configure the columns that you want in a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet gets embedded under every page for people to transcribe into. Natasha asks if there's a way to download an archive of the comments when the project is completed. Yeah,
we have a couple different ways to do that. So we have about 20 different export formats, and you can export your projects at any time. You can export them every week if you want to. One of them, our most kind of comprehensive one, is a technical format, TEI XML, and that will include all the comments that go with every single page. But we also have a way to download just the comments in a spreadsheet. So that it's actually a really great way to do some quality control, because you can kind of scan through all the comments and look for words like duplicate, because sometimes you'll have duplicate pages or duplicate images, or, you know, indecipherable, or can't figure this out. You know, you can easily kind of look through that. And though that spreadsheet download has a link back to the page as well.
Are there other questions that people have that, you know, perhaps you prefer to just ask out loud rather than
Typing?
typing? If so, feel free to just unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Monse. I'm sorry I don't have the camera today. So, what about, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about also having volunteers for metadata. Could you discuss that a little bit, maybe?
You want to show it?
Sure, maybe we should jump into that section, because we can talk about metadata and we could talk about the columnar material as well. So that's a good opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen and change the aspect ratio of this a little bit, and we'll just jump in. And I encourage people to interrupt. If you have other questions, you can type them in the chat. So let's just walk through kind of the basic flow, and then we'll jump into metadata and columnar material. This is a project out of University of Southern Mississippi, the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi project. And I'm just going to drop in to one page, or one page of one letter, and say, all right, well, let's transcribe this. 11th, 1873.
R.L. Powers?
I think that's a C.
Okay.
And I'm going to save this right now. We're not going to transcribe the whole letter because time is short.
Okay, you made a lot of mistakes.
Oh, tonight. Okay, what did I do wrong?
Yeah, so that is that really Governor Miss?
Yes. Let's zoom in. M-I long S-S. Yep.
Governor of Mississippi. I
Right.
see. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I would have been tempted to add the header stuff in there too, but I would probably have to go read their
Transcription
transcriptions.
conventions.
Right.
So is that the only problem so far?
Yeah.
Okay. This person is resigning their post, so we'll see what's going on there. So one of the things that we do in From the Page is that we save a version every time someone saves a page. We can track that. And that lets everyone know exactly the status of that page. So you can see Lindsay Peterson, who runs the project, uploaded it, looks like this morning. I started transcribing it. You can see in green the text that I added. And then we made another edit where you can see, all right, well, we corrected the spelling here. So anything that was removed is red and crossed out. Anything that is added is green. And that kind of gives you an audit history of who has done what. It's also useful in classrooms, especially if you have students pairing with one transcribing and another editing. You can see, okay, who did what, right? Who is responsible for this? Let me jump into these other formats fairly quickly. So this is not a narrative. This is not a letter. This is a marriage certificate that the Maryland State Archives is transcribing. And you can see that they have configured fields for people to transcribe into. So you've got a controlled vocabulary of months and of counties. Then we have day, years, and they're asking people for first name, middle name, last name, and suffix. These are very popular because people can plow through them. I've seen for the Baltimore City marriage records, I've seen one volunteer transcribe 100 cards an hour, which is just incredible. I was worried something was wrong, and no, she was just a really fast typist. So someone mentioned columns. This is an example of columnar transcription. This is the Florida State Archives, Florida Memory Project is transcribing a lot of their tax rolls. And you can see this data is, not something that has either a block of text per image or one record per image. You've got some fields like the county and the year somewhere up here that apply to every record on the page, but each one of these entries really is its own record. So they have configured the fields that they want. They actually are very closely matching the fields in the original document.
Which is good, because you don't want to confuse your transcribers.
Right. And so they have people who are transcribing as they go.
Could we show what this looks like on the configuration slide?
Yes, let's do that. That would probably help us kind of explain that setup.
Yeah. This and I think field
Yeah.
base, it's all kind of the same
While I
approach.
navigate that,
Yeah.
could you explain how you get this data out and
Yeah.
what it looks like?
Yeah, so we have a lot of different export formats for the spreadsheet things, the things that have that spreadsheet interface. And export, you can actually export a spreadsheet, and we take the kind of page level data like the date or the county. Often you have kind of these headers on each page, and we propagate those. We pull those down to every line of the spreadsheet. So if you had an entry for one particular person in a tax roll, you'd also get the date and the county information that goes along with that. If you're doing kind of a field-based project like the Maryland marriage certificates, you can export those as a spreadsheet as well, where you get one line per record. All the textual stuff you can export as plain text, HTML, Word docs, PDFs, lots and lots. And we try to actually make all that table stuff work in those exports formats as well. So if you want to do kind of a reading copy instead of really an index, you can do both.
Right.
So,
so again, on how to set up these columns, here's an example of a project that we ran. You can see in the preview how this is configured. We've got 5 bits of header information, an instruction, and then a spreadsheet that has 5 columns. We just set that up by saying line 1 has these 4 fields, line 2 has this instruction and this spreadsheet. And if we go to configure the spreadsheet, we can say, here are the fields, here are the columns that we want for this spreadsheet. And there's a handful of data types that you can select and choose from that are going to affect how this is presented and what kind of validations and warning messages might be done. On the question about metadata, let's take a look at that. This is a project that Dartmouth University Library is running, working with early Arctic exploration papers. So they're running this as a combination transcription project and metadata project. They're having people transcribe this. So, we could be the ones transcribing this. They're using some pretty sophisticated markup.
which you don't have to do, but you
Right.
can.
And then, so what they're having people do is transcribe. So we looked at page 1, we looked at page 2, and then in the next step, what they're doing is asking for item level metadata. So they have configured the fields that they want: document type, a date, lists of authors, a suggested title, for people to use. And the people who are doing this, they can alternate between looking at the images or looking at the transcribed text, or if there were metadata that had been imported, older metadata that perhaps is being revised, they could look at that as well. This project does not have any.
So we see this, this one is transcription plus metadata, which is interesting. There's a project out of Ohio University that's doing metadata for dance posters, and they're not transcribing, they're just collecting metadata fields, because these are kind of, they're posters, right? There's not a lot of text on it, but they're very interested in some very specific things, like who was the choreographer? What was the date of the performance? Where was the performance? But who was the choreographer? What was the name of the performance? And they're actually have reached out to a lot of their alumni from that program to help them work on that, because they figure they'll know a lot about, anyone can fill out a form, but sometimes they'll know more and have more context and more passion around it.
So there's a suggestion, I'm going back to the chat here, there's a suggestion about making connections with schools' honor societies to get transcription listed as an approved volunteer opportunity, or to do a transcribe-a-thon with the society. So we'll say that we get probably once a week, we get requests from people saying, do you approve volunteer hours? You know, do you approve service hours? And sometimes that's because people are looking for their students who are looking for service hours. Sometimes that's because you have people with court-appointed hours that they have to fill in. Sometimes you have people who are part of organizations like the Scouts, where they have to do this kind of work. So if you can list yourself as being willing to certify these projects, then that does count.
And we actually have a whole page of projects that we know and who to contact to get that certification. We're also working on some features where people can just pull down their own hours, because not, you know, a middle schooler doing school stuff doesn't necessarily need a signed letter from you in order to get their volunteer hours certified, right?
And then Anna also makes a suggestion, which I completely agree, is doing a transcribe-a-thon with the society. Again, especially with students, especially with cursive, being there to walk them over that difficulty, oh, it helps so much.
So there's a comment from Emily that she likes that we can export in TEI. Is it possible to have volunteers use TEI tags as they transcribe? Stop moving the chat. For example, places and names. I'd be interested in any recommendations you have related to this. We have lots.
Yes, sure. Let me go share my screen again. Here's an example of a project that we run in which we're doing that. So this is a Virginia tobacco farm from 1823 through 1888. So there's lots of mentions of slavery, places, agricultural activities, people's names, and people and places. So for projects that are trying to do this kind of scholarly editing style work.
Or just to really kind of deep dive on people, places, things that are mentioned. Right. If you have a place to put that in your systems, that's amazing, or even just a way to display them.
So we do have a handful of options here. We support about 30 or 40 TEI tags. So date is an example. So people can do direct XML TEI markup within a document. They can also do HTML markup, which we will convert to TEI for the TEI exports. But for entities like places and
wait, let's pause and let's talk deep dive just a minute.
Yeah.
Most volunteers don't want to do TEI markup, but people do want to be able to mark strike-throughs and deletions, subscripts, superscripts. So providing some of these buttons that you kind of saw at the top of the last page, and this is where you can kind of pick and choose which buttons you're going to show, is great, because they can just highlight the word and click the button and it will wrap it in a tag. So that makes it a lot easier, and it makes it more standard, because there's often different ways to mark things in TEI. So, you know, even if you don't want to do kind of a full-on markup project, sometimes having ways to do strike-throughs and superscripts, subscripts, things like that people are going to ask about is good.
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, people want tools to
do
the job.
They want to do it right. So give them ways to do it right. Okay, and then the second answer is about
entities. So we have a special entity markup that is basically uses wiki links. These are the same links used in Wikipedia to indicate passages within a text that refer to an entity. So here you see Jacob. Jacob we have marked up as referring to Jacob P. Graves. Meadsville itself is an entity as well. It's a place. And once this has been marked up, we can kind of mouse over these and say, all right, well, show me stuff about Jacob Graves. And we see, okay, well, we've got a biography of Jacob Graves. We have a index of all the places that mention Jacob Graves that were linked. I can actually read every page that's been indexed to Jacob Graves. And this all will get exported in the TEI. So if I go to export that, we can pull it out in several formats. But I'm just, because the question was TEI specific, what we're able to do then is to create one of these TEI documents in which, if we look for Jacob Graves, he appears in the header and the personography with his article. And then we can also see the references to Jacob Graves in the text itself. Once we get there. There we go. So here's our reference to Jacob started to Meadsville. And so it's a reference string that points there.
So this is great if you're, working on academic projects, documentary edition projects. I would say maybe 20% or fewer of our projects actually go this deep, but it's really cool when you have the time and the project to do it.
I will say there are some non-TEI projects that do this kind of entity work, and export those entities, those subjects that have been mentioned, as spreadsheets, right? So that's another option that's not a TEI based one.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Oh, here we go. For the columnar documents, would it be possible to allow for a line overlay to help transcribers keep their place? Yes, that actually exists. The problem is that it's really, so we have that built so that there's a kind of a green bar that goes across the screen as people are transcribing, highlighting the part of the image that they are transcribing, right? It's linked to the spreadsheet where their cursor is there.
If you're on line 3, it highlights line 3.
Right. That's the goal. The reality is that for that to work, your documents have to be very consistently printed and very consistently imaged, because you know,
what we ask when
yes,
you configure that is how many lines are on this page. So you say 25.
right.
And then we say, please highlight on this sample image that we've pulled from your document where those 25 lines are. So, you know, there's headers and there's footers and things. We don't want those to included because can't do math on that. So we ask you to highlight a subset. And then we basically do math and we're like, okay, this is this many pixels high, 25 lines. That means the first one should be this many, and this one, and this one, and this one. And it works great for pre-printed forms. It doesn't work
that have been consistently imaged.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, you should totally do this and play with it, and it may work great and it may not.
Right, right. It exists. It just may not be appropriate for your project and your materials.
Can I just clarify then, because that's so if you use the Alachua County tax rolls that you had from Florida memory as an example, because this is actually the transcription challenge that we had was for a different county in Florida, and I've had to literally download the document, put it in Word or something else on a second screen, draw myself a red line, and drag it down myself in order to be able to see across the page.
Right. That's a great idea.
So
yeah.
Yes, but not everybody
Yeah.
is technology savvy where they can do that or has 2 screens or whatever. So the question was more not that it would automatically follow you down the page,
Yeah.
but if there was a way that, you know, we could have the line, you know, have just an overlay line where we can move the line as we're transcribing to try to keep track of where we're at, because especially when you're talking about these really long columnar records like that, like even census records, you know.
Right. No, I think that's a great feature idea.
That is a great idea, and I think I know exactly how we could build that too. So that's
perfect.
fantastic.
For sure.
Thank you. Yes, because they're not always consistent either. I mean, one page might have, you know, 5 entries on it where the land description was this long, and then another page might have 25 on it where all of the lines were very close together. So it's not consistent in a lot of these original documents. So perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great idea.
So is there anything else, other questions or other things we can show you? Anyone?
Yeah, any other just general questions about crowdsourcing or questions about From the Page? Got to say, Lori, we don't usually walk out of these webinars with a new feature idea. This is really cool.
So we run webinars every month, sometimes 2 in a month. We have a number coming up that are more kind of what you can do when you've already transcribed your material. So we're technologists, so we're really getting into some of the large language models like ChatGPT and stuff. So we've got some webinars that are tied to that coming up, and we've got one that isn't on the schedule yet, but I'm just dropping that whole link. That's a documentary editing project. Make sure it goes to the whole chat.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, we'd love to see you at one of those upcoming webinars. Yeah, one coming up for a documentary edition project, which is really interesting because they're doing a ton of like that extra markup and that research and annotation. there was a question about how do we define large and small organizations. So she looks like Natasha went to our pricing page. All of our pricing is very transparent. So you can just go look and see if it fits your organization. Really, the difference is how many pages are you going to have in your active projects.
Right.
A lot of our state archives have a lot of pages in a given project, just because they're large and they run multiple projects at a time. So that generally bumps them up to the large organization range, which is how many pages?
100,000.
Up to 100,000 pages. Small org is up to 50,000. So
yeah, that's the difference.
That's the difference. That's really the only difference. We do a couple of technical things like single sign-on support and things for large organizations. But if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them over email or hop on a Zoom or anything. So
thank you all for coming. And thank you for the great questions during the presentation and afterwards, and the feature idea, Lori. Awesome. Yeah, so we hope to hear from you soon.
Yeah, jump on that the quick start call, because I'd love to see some of your material and help you explore getting it up and inviting volunteers to work with it.
Bye everyone. Lori, you have another question?
No, I was saving the chat. I'm like, don't hang up.
You're okay. Yeah, save the chat.
I was trying to catch this. Yeah, the chat. But thank you. Thanks, guys. And actually, we did. Well, I guess I'm the only one here. We did, after we talked. We had our challenge. We did pretty good, but yeah, it was a slog. I mean, the types of documents, it was a slog. But so maybe we only transcribed like 60 pages, but it was like 600 index records.
Yes.
That's
how you should count it, for sure.
Yes, the records.
Exactly. And so that was in the weekend, and it was a little tough to kind of tell. There were some stats that were a little odd, right? So there were some stats that I couldn't tell as I was trying with my view of it, with just seeing the general statistics that everybody could see at the bottom. And then when Matthew Story sent me his spreadsheet didn't seem to have too much more. I don't think it really had anything more, but it was in a kind of a different format. Yeah. So I was having trouble kind of seeing what was a started page or what was a remaining page. So I think the pages remaining was a little weird, because when I did the math the first time, I thought it was one thing. And then when I did the math the next time and I saw where the deltas were, I'm like, wait, that's probably not what that word means. And so I sort of redid the math a little bit. So just in the stats and how we tracked and like did the cheerleading emails to the group and stuff like that during the weekend was probably the only thing that was a little funky. But that and trying to walk across the page and get all the little tick marks in the right place. Yeah.
No, I love the red line, the movable red line idea.
Yeah.
It would be great. Yeah. And just to help people, I mean, letters are pretty standard. I mean, you can kind of see how a sentence flows and tell what line you're on and stuff like that. Those are not to worry, but it's these weird, funky ones that are hard to read across.
Absolutely.
Anyway. Okay. Well, thank you. I got the chat saved.
Bye.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks for the seminar. Okay, bye.